Good morning, everyone. Thank you very much for joining this Taxpayers Alliance panel, where today we're going to be asking the question, lost liberty, why don't the Conservatives trust people? Joining me on the panel this morning, we have on my far right the fantastic Simon Clark, the Director of Forest, Emily Fielder from the Adam Smith Institute, the Director of Communications. On my left, we have Joe Dinage, the Deputy Editor of CapEx, and Andrew Rosendale, the Member of Parliament for Romford. So to kick things off, we're asking the question here, after 14 years of government that saw the state continue to expand, move into new areas of our lives, restricting liberty and introducing new taxes to drive change, whether that's from the tobacco ban to the sugar tax, paternalism was the order of the day. Have the Conservatives given up trusting people? And will the party re-embrace liberty, or is paternalism here to stay? So to kick things off, going to go to my friend Joe, who's going to make his statement, and then we'll move along.
Cheers, Ben. So I want to talk about the politics of nanny statism. What are the impulses that drive politicians to go for coercive policies like the generational tobacco ban, taxes on sugar, and the ban on single-use vapes? So I suppose that a good starting point would be to look at whether they are particularly effective or not. Maybe these are fantastic ideas and they historically always work. Well, we know that that's not true. Cannabis, for example, has been criminalised in Britain for almost 100 years, and I challenge any of you to find me a high street in a city centre that doesn't have a bit of a whiff of it. You could also look at tobacco as well. You don't even have to go to drugs. Nanny state measures in Australia in the sector have opened up this thriving and violent criminal market for the illegal sale of tobacco. So we know that they don't work, but perhaps people just really want them. Perhaps they just sound fantastic. And Britons, for whatever reason, aren't huge fans of personal freedom. That may be more depressingly true. When the Tories announced the ban on single-use vapes, they accompanied the announcement with some polling that showed that 70% of respondents thought that this was a fantastic idea. And you've sort of got to wonder why that is. And I think it's because for decades and decades, as lots of people have said, through bad policies, through quite pervasive statism, politicians have curated an environment in which people assume that the state is the singular vessel to solve all of their problems. Yet, of course, in actuality, they're not always particularly good at doing that. So politicians, like any provider of services, respond to incentives. And if the incentives that the public give them encourage them to be as illiberal, as ineffective, as invasive as possible in their policy making, then kind of annoyingly, that's the sort of thing that we get. So when you've got this interplay between an electorate which expects the state to do pretty ineffective things, but to do things supposedly in their interest, and politicians who are all too happy to oblige them because they respond to short-term electoral cycles and things like bans kind of act as political plasters for chronic public health issues, it makes it incredibly difficult to think boldly about how to go about solving the kind of chronic problems that Britain faces. And this isn't just restricted to public health. This is the case in transport, it's the case in education, it's the case in housing, it's the case in migration. Politicians are not given the right incentives fundamentally by the public to kind of think very critically about policy and go for sort of evidence-based policy rather than kind of pulling the same levers that they basically know don't work but kind of sound fantastic. So I think in answer to the question, why don't the Tories trust people, it's because we don't expect them to. And that's where organisations like the ones represented on this panel come in, places like the Adam Smith Institute, like Forest, like the CPS, like the Taxpayers Alliance. need to keep banging that drum that it's evidence-based policy making, bold ideas that provide material improvements to people's lives. It's not politicians indulging in this kind of culture and politics of creative stagnation that does. That, in fact, often makes people's lives worse, and it makes sort of public health issues like obesity, like smoking, all that harder to tackle because it gives people the wrong impression about what's needed to solve them.
Excellent. Thank you, Joe. Just to quickly follow up on some of your comments there, you mentioned sort of why politicians seem so eager to ban things. How do you think we go about changing that sort of almost instinct that they have?
Well, I think that would be quite a good question for Andrew, potentially. But I think it's got to come from within the Conservative Party. So there's a Tory leadership race on, as we all know, and I suspect that the successful candidate will be able to sort of provide a combination of sort of good first principles with an appreciation for what makes good policy. That's something that I think a lot of people felt was lacking in the Conservative Party for quite a long time. So it's got to come from within the party itself. But also, as I said, it's the work of great journalists, great think tankers, great commentators who publish excellent pieces of research and articles explaining why these policies don't actually work and trying to shift the Overton window in a direction which, rather than allowing politicians to revert to their base instincts, really encourages them to think critically about the stuff that works. So it's got to be a two-pronged strategy from within the Conservative Party and campaign groups and pressure groups and think tanks and journalists as well.
Excellent, thank you. Andrew?
Thank you. If you don't mind, I'm going to stand up for my introductory remarks. Could I firstly thank the Taxpayers Alliance for inviting me to... I'm one of these politicians that votes all these ghastly things through. I'm not representing one of these organisations, but I am in Parliament, and I'll tell you why I went into Parliament, and I'll tell you why I joined the Conservative Party, because I believe in freedom with responsibility. That's the core of what our party is meant to stand for. My first party conference was in 1982, would you believe, and I first met Margaret Thatcher at that conference. And she inspired me, as I know she inspired many of you, to fight for true ideas of freedom and liberty. The Conservative Party needs to go back to those ideas. We have a government which is going to be nanny state on stilts. They're going to do everything possible to control people's lives, to tax us more, to dictate how we govern our own way of living. We as a Conservative Party have to go back to our core principles once again and challenge those statist, centralisation of power, controlling of people's lives. We need to go back to the idea that we are a free people and we are best to make the decisions about our own lives. Now, that's not to say that the government shouldn't have a role. Of course, we don't believe in anarchy. We believe that there should be education in society so that people can choose. But choice is surely, Mr. Chairman, what we should be promoting as a Conservative Party. Unfortunately, the last 14 years, under different Prime Ministers, some better than others, made all kinds of bad decisions, which I think undermined our core values. Many of those things are going to be spoken about today and have already been mentioned in the introductory remarks. So we need to understand as a party that we have to be in power for a purpose. And that purpose should be the spread of freedom, giving people greater choice in their lives, making sure that the state does the minimum and the people themselves do the maximum, allowing people to own their own wealth and their own property without the state taking it from them, but also giving people the right to make their own decisions about what they do and also benefit from their labours, so that when they work hard, when they show that they want to build something strong and build a great a life for their family and themselves, that the government doesn't take it away from them. But these are basic core Conservative ideas. Freedom with responsibility in a free society. Freedom under a rule of law. if we base everything on those principles, a lot of the mistakes that previous Conservative governments have made, and the new government is making already and will make in the next 5 years, if we base our policies on those core values, ladies and gentlemen, I believe we will start getting ourselves back on the right track again. And I can tell you, as a Member of Parliament in the House of Commons, I've not been a minister for the last 14 years, because I think MPs need to be independently minded and not just do as the whips tell them. And so when we had the vote on COVID and the crazy lockdowns, I was one of the very few MPs that voted against the whole lot. Because to my mind, all the government needed to do is to give people the choice and make their own decisions. And I think the problems we're facing today are largely to do with the punitive lockdowns, the removal of people's liberties and freedoms during that period, and the colossal cost to our society that those lockdowns caused. So I think we have a chance now as a party to rebuild, but we need to rebuild based on those basic core principles again. We need to move away from the mush of the last 14 years, get back to our core foundations. If we do that, we will surely be a proud Conservative Party again that will govern our country and deserve to do so.
Thank you very much, Andrew. How would you characterise the mood in Parliament, and perhaps particularly the Conservative Party MPs? Do you think this sort of seemingly relentless nanny statism is going to run the course of the Parliament?
Look, I'm afraid that what often happens is that someone comes up with a good idea, as Rishi came up last year about the smoking ban, the age, gradually banning it depending on age. And a lot of people in politics don't have that guiding compass, and they'll just go with whatever sounds good. And that's where we go wrong every time. What we need is that guiding compass to guide our party's policies on a whole range of things. So I'm afraid a lot of MPs will go along with whatever they think sounds good at the time. But I think we need more MPs who actually think carefully about the consequences of how they vote and the legislation they pass. Passing all kinds of legislation which restricts people's lives and liberties is not what we should be doing as a party. So the mood in the Conservative Party, look, I'll be honest, it's not great. We're in Parliament. There's only 121 of us compared to what we had before. But you know something? I'm actually feeling a little bit more optimistic than I was a month or two ago. I think we're on the verge of getting a new leader. I'm not going to tell you who I'm backing, of course. But we won't deserve to be in government if we don't get this right. We've got a chance to get this right, get our party back on a firm and clear Conservative direction again. If we do that, I think we've got a chance next election of being in government again, and actually we've got to do what Mrs Thatcher did in 79, come back as a radical Conservative government, do radical things and change the country for the better. And that means a bonfire of so many of the legislation that we've previously passed, but also a bonfire of a lot of Tony Blair's legislation, which I'm afraid we're living with the consequences of that today.
Thank you. Emily?
Yeah, so I'd like to start by making a couple of points. So there are currently over 6 million people on the NHS waiting list. Our state pension obligation stands at £8.9 trillion. Typical first-time buyer in London is going to have to save for 31 years to raise a deposit for a home. That's 20 more years. Twice more than 20 years ago. And our tax is at a record high, but 80% say that Britain's public services are in a bad state. So what is our new government looking at doing? Well, apparently it's cigarette warning-style packaging on sugary tweets. It's banning energy drinks for under 16s. Not content with a generational smoking ban, they want to ban smoking in pub gardens. In the interest of balance, I should say I made the exact same complaint at the TPA panel last year, where I complained that all the problems were the same, but the main offering for the Conservatives at the conference speech was the generational smoking ban. This is a genuine problem with our current political class. Obviously, that's a generalisation. We've got some MPs that are fighting for it. But it is a problem that lots of them feel that they can't really solve the big issues, so they're going to tinker and interfere and do paternalist policies instead. So Tories, they did sugar taxes, calorie counts, smoking ban, lockdown, etc. But my concern that I really want to raise today is that by implementing these measures, politicians are showing that they have a fundamental misunderstanding of what public health and the wider role of government should be. So liberals, like myself, often talk about the harm principle, which means that individuals should have free will unless their actions cause harm to someone else. So this principle in public health means protecting people from what we call externalities. So lockdowns, for example, young people like myself weren't really worried about our own health, but we were really worried about infecting our older relatives or even older people that we passed in the shops. And that's why we tended to, that's why we did follow the lockdown rules. Was the argument that they used for banning indoor smoking. You can say whether that's right or wrong, but their argument at the time was it was to do with passive smoking. Even the original ULEZ zone was all about reducing pollution. And that's what public health used to be. It used to be about massive disease outbreaks, pollution, stuff like the Great Smog of '52, but the harm principle now means something else. It now means harm caused by you to yourself through what the state deems to be poor lifestyle choices. And that means that public health has now become private health. It's also no longer about correcting information asymmetries. So free market economists tend to say that information means a better market. But we don't measure the success of things like advertising bans or that nasty cigarette packaging by how informed people feel. We tend to measure the success by how many people have given up smoking or how many people have reduced their calorie intake. So even if you don't actually mind paternalism principle, as Joe touched on earlier, it doesn't work. So my colleague yesterday said lots of people tend to become a classical liberal through empiricism, even if not by sheer force of ideology. So if you look at banning smoking, for example, all we're going to do is drive it underground. As Joe said, have we won the war on drugs? No. If you look at minimum unit alcohol pricing in Scotland, well, Scottish alcohol deaths are at a 15-year high, so that's obviously not worked either. But another thing I should say is that when we talk about liberty, we tend to talk about what we consume, so food, drink, smoking, but this is extended to all other aspects of life. The same political culture that is giving you these paternalistic policies is affecting your ability to buy a house and your ability to have a night out in London. It's the same anti-risk, anti-fun, pathological aversion of letting people extend their property without annoying neighbours, building new houses, closing down venues, no Greggs serving hot food in Leicester Square because what about the crime, the Met anti-social dispersal order during the football, Andrew touched earlier on Tony Blair. In 1977, we had 25 regulators. Now we have 95. So the question of this panel is, are the Tories pro-liberty? Now, I used to be much more optimistic on this. I used to say, yes, liberty is really compatible with conservative values. It's compatible with the idea of a smaller state. It's compatible with the idea that we think that people know what to do with their money best. People know how to organise their communities and make choices that affect them and their families. But I went to a spectator panel yesterday on a very similar topic, and Fraser Nelson made the point that if you want to look at how pro-liberty the Conservative Party is, you just need to look at their voting record. And liberty-loving MPs have become a wing of the party, but they don't make up the party. But the only optimistic thing I will say is that the membership does tend to be a lot more pro-freedom than the politicians sometimes, and you can see the leadership candidates really looking at this as they make their pitch. So Tom Tugendhat, for example, is making the point fairly that he voted down national insurance rises, and James Cleverly was on the radio this morning saying that he thought that lockdown was too excessive. So I think they are at least starting to listen to members, and that is a good thing.
Thank you, Emily. Just to pick up on something, where do you see, you sort of ran through very well the Tories' recent history of banning things and trying to regulate our lives. Where do you see the next restrictions coming?
I think that the next this Labour government is going to be pretty paternalistic. I think we've already seen that from the first couple of months that they've been in government. So this thing that was announced on Sunday about the packaging on sugary foods, for example, Andrew Gwynn said that they were looking at reducing pub opening hours, although to be fair to him, that was actually shut down by the Labour government. But I think we are about to see a lot more of this stuff coming through the policy pipeline. We're probably going to see further movement on vaping, not content with banning smoking. I think they're going to start looking at vaping. Probably going to see further movement on alcohol. We're probably going to see further restrictions on economic liberty, which is probably something else we should talk about. Higher taxes, more restrictions on business. And Joe touched on this earlier. I think we are going to have to square this with the fact that the population seem to be quite anti-liberty. So, for example, I think it was a poll last year said that 20% thought that pubs should still be closed, 23% said that we should reintroduce the rule of six. So post-lockdown, that is a problem that politicians are going to have to square.
Excellent, thank you. Without further ado, Simon.
Thanks, Ben. Now, the question is, why don't the Conservatives trust people? And it's a very good question. Margaret Thatcher understood that people wanted more control over their own lives, which is why the right to buy their own council homes was so successful and so popular. Boris Johnson understood that many people wanted Britain to take back control of our laws from the European Union, and he won a huge election majority. I'm not sure, though, that either Mrs. Thatcher or Boris Johnson were or are typical Conservatives. Traditionally, Conservatives have always been fairly paternalistic, or worse. This, after all, is the party that in Scotland in the 19th century represented the lairds and the landed gentry, the best of whom looked after their crofters by employing a sort of benign autocracy, although some weren't quite so benign. Now, a strong degree of paternalism has therefore always been ingrained in the Conservative Party, and it's certainly been my experience that personal liberty is not a high priority for many Conservatives, especially when in government. Now, apologies to Tim Scott, the current director of the Freedom Association, and to two other of his predecessors who are here today. But 22 years ago, I edited Freedom Today, the Freedom Association magazine. And after 2 years and a dozen issues, I was sacked for being too liberal. Now, my mistake was thinking that we could reinvent the magazine as a more classically liberal publication, when I knew in my heart of hearts that despite its name, it was neither libertarian nor especially liberal on many issues. Like the Tory party, the overwhelming majority of its members was socially conservative and paternalistic. Now, despite that, in 2008, here in Birmingham, Forest and the Freedom Association launched the first Freedom Zone, which ran for 2 days in parallel to the main conference. One of the meetings was entitled, "You Can't Do That, the Anti-Social Regulation of Public Space." It featured a Conservative member of the London Assembly who supported the workplace smoking ban and described smoking as a disgusting habit. Now, in response, I suggested that he probably had one or two disgusting habits as well. I also made the point that if his views were representative of the Conservative Party, they could kiss my vote goodbye. What really shocked me, however, were contributions from two smokers in the audience who said they opposed the smoking ban, but they supported bans on drinking alcohol in public parks. Now, smokers, drinkers, smokers who drink, drinkers who smoke, we all have to stick together and defend one another's interests. You can't pick and choose according to your likes and dislikes. Now, smoking has been described as the canary for civil liberties, or a bellwether for liberty, and that is absolutely right. The point is, if we don't stand up for adults who enjoy smoking, what's next? Are public health campaigners going to move from informing the public about nutrition and healthy eating and drinking to banning more and more products that are deemed unhealthy, while dictating the amount of sugar, alcohol, or calories we are permitted to consume? Now, in the Freedom Zone in 2008, we also discussed libertarian paternalism, which many Conservatives have subsequently embraced. Libertarian paternalism essentially means nudging people to change their lifestyle. Now, I remember Eamon Butler of the Adam Smith Institute saying he was sympathetic to the concept, but politicians would always go too far. And that's exactly what has happened. The proposed ban on smoking in outdoor public places, including beer gardens, is a form of nudging because it's designed to create an environment in which it is increasingly hard for people to smoke in any public place, and this, it is believed, will encourage smokers to quit for their own good. Now, leaving aside the unintended consequences for the hospitality industry, this is coercion, pure and simple. It's designed not to nudge, but to force people to quit. And it's a continuation of the bully state that the Conservatives did nothing to reverse while in office. The consequence has been a gradual erosion of tolerance with a small but vociferous group of anti-smoking activists dictating policy, including conservative policy. Now, a few years ago, I was asked what was the biggest change I'd noticed in the 20 years I'd been director of forests. And I said that when I started, there were voluntary agreements and codes of practice. But today, there's far more legislation, and coercion has replaced common sense. Now, the generational smoking ban, which is actually a ban on the sale of tobacco to people born after 2008, is a classic case of not trusting young adults to make their own decisions. In my view, if you're old enough to drive a car, join the army, possess a credit card, purchase alcohol and vote at 18, you are perfectly old enough to choose to buy tobacco. But Rishi Sunak, a Conservative Prime Minister, didn't see it that way, and the policy will be reintroduced by Labour, and it's going to infantilise future generations of adults. It seems to me, however, looking on the bright side, that over the next few years there is a wonderful opportunity for Conservatives to create clear blue water between the Conservative Party and all other parties who want to restrict our freedoms. The one exception, of course, is Nigel Farage's Reform Party, and you can be sure that if the Conservatives don't occupy this space, then Reform will. And Reform will pick up even more votes at the Conservatives' expense. The problem is, Conservative politicians often defend individual freedoms when in opposition, but as soon as they're in power, they change their tune or accept the status quo they've inherited. Now, I don't think paternalism is here to stay, but neither do I think that things will get better anytime soon. The nanny state, or what I call the bully state, is undoubtedly going to get worse under Labour. But would things be much better under a Conservative government? The last 14 years suggest not. I'm going to end with a quote by Claire Fox, now Baroness Fox, director of the Academy of Ideas. 2 years ago, at a fringe meeting hosted by Forest and the Taxpayers Alliance in the same think tank in Birmingham, she said, "I'm on the left, and I'm far more pro-freedom than anyone I've met in the Conservative Party. What has happened to you lot? You've lost your bottle, in my opinion." And she was right. The Conservatives have lost their bottle, from grassroots to government, on a whole range of issues, and that includes trusting people. And if you don't trust the people, how can you expect them to trust you? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Simon. Your comments have prompted me. I perhaps should have said this at the beginning. I need to declare an interest as someone who enjoys a smoke and a drink every now and then. But just picking up on something there, there's obviously been touted this idea of an outdoor smoking ban, which you mentioned. What do you think people like those who are here this morning need to be doing to try and push back on this?
Well, I think it's been interesting that since the Labour plan was leaked to The Sun a few weeks ago, there has been a lot of pushback, far more pushback, in fact, than on the generational tobacco sales ban. I think with the tobacco sales ban, because it's been pushed down the road, it's not going to come into effect until 2027 at the earliest. And of course, it's not going to affect existing smokers. I think a lot of people have pushed it to one side and don't think it's very important when actually it is. But when people are told that smoking is going to be banned in outdoor areas, where there is not a shred of evidence that you are harming anybody else, including children, I think people see this as utterly ridiculous. And even Labour ministers, within 2 or 3 days, having talked about the threat of passive smoking in the outside or in outdoor areas, they rode back and said, oh, no, this is actually all about trying to encourage people to quit smoking. But in the last few weeks, we've seen a lot of pushback from the hospitality industry. If you look at many local newspapers, there are publicans saying this is absolutely outrageous. It takes away their opportunity to make decisions that are in the best interests of their business. Publicans have been saying that, look, for years we've catered for smokers and non-smokers and beer gardens and outside pubs, and it's worked perfectly well. Nobody's complaining about it. So why on earth are we doing it? And the reality is, I have to say, going back to your question, Ben, is that there's probably not a lot that people in the Conservative Party can say that's going to influence Labour. The reality is you've got 121 MPs. Opposition has to come from the hospitality industry, and it also has to come from within Labour. And I was at the Labour conference last week, and I was speaking to representatives of Labour student groups. And there is a lot of opposition to this policy within Labour. Unfortunately, we're very early in the Labour government, and not many Labour MPs, if any, are really going to fight back or vote against their government on this issue, because they won't want to destabilise the government. But there is opposition out there, so obviously we have to try and unite it. But I do hope that people within the Tory party do speak out. But the reality is, if we're going to get this policy changed or reversed, it probably has to come from the Labour Party rather than the Conservative Party at the moment.
Super, thank you. So without further ado, we'll throw it out to questions from the floor. So there's a gentleman here on the left-hand side, third row with glasses, and a chap at the back with a sort of jacket on.
Thank you. Chris Bowman from Tunbridge Wells. I'd like to pick up a little on science. I think we need to look at what effect the nanny state has. I think the sugar tax has been good. I've not come across anybody who complains that there's not enough sugar in their drinks, yet the industry has reduced sugar in drinks. On the other hand, as Joe pointed out, the ban on cannabis is a complete waste of time. It's putting people in prison, taking away people's... I'm not a cannabis smoker, I hasten to add. Not now, anyway. But I think it's just silly. And on the taxpayers' allowance, we've got high taxes, we've got low growth. Let's listen to science. We need low tax and high growth. Thank you.
Here on that last point.
So clearly the focus today is on public health by the sounds of it, but I can think of various other ways in which liberty has been lost. The centrepiece of the Tory manifesto was forced labour for young people. We've also had an attack on freedom of speech. Does the panel think that all that is part of the same underlying trend, or are the kind of drivers completely separate, right, to the kind of central public health issue that we've been talking about?
Thank you. Emily, would you like to pick up on the first question there, about following the science?
Yeah, you make a really good point about following the science. So I think the point we should make that sometimes government gets it wrong too. So for an example, in 1992, the EU banned snus, except Sweden, and guess what? Sweden now has the lowest smoking rate in the developed world. In 2011, Denmark had a sin tax on saturated fat, and they repealed it just over a year later, because had it succeeded in just shifting consumption from fat to carbohydrates, it could have actually exacerbated obesity rates. We talk a lot about sugary food, junk food, etc., but we don't really talk about exercise ever. Maybe that's because there's something the government can't mandate. Generally, people are confused about what counts as junk food too, which makes it very difficult to have good laws. So, for example, I don't know if you saw the recent YouGov poll, which asked people which type of foods they thought were junk food, and there was quite a lot of confusion. I think something like 13% said that granola was junk food, and 1% said that strawberries were junk food. So I don't really think that that's a good basis on which to make policy. I think generally it would be much better to permit what Mill called different experiences of living.
Agreed. Andrew, how about that sort of second point there about the general trend of
Well, I think the key point that was made by the gentleman over there was the lack of freedom of speech. I think that, to me, is the key issue we're now facing. Yes, we can argue about whether it's right to discourage people engaging in certain habits or eating certain foods. We can argue about that. There are health concerns that government have a right to discuss. I've said earlier, my general view is that it should be about education rather than compulsion. But the trend that really worries me is what seems to be demolition of the right of freedom of speech. It seems that everywhere I go now, people are afraid to say what they think. They're afraid to talk openly in case they offend someone. They're afraid to tell a joke even. This is not a good trend in our society, and I think it's deeply un-British that we're losing that passion for freedom of speech, freedom of debate, freedom to say what we think. Yes, it's not nice if you say hateful things, and I don't encourage that, and none of us would encourage that. Politeness is always something that is part of the British character. But to take away people's right, or the feeling that they no longer have that right to speak freely about things that they believe in, I think that's a very worrying trend in our society. It's almost, in some senses, when I go around, when I talk to people, I go to organisations, events in my constituency, where people talk to me openly about how they feel. But I feel that we are becoming almost like a whispering society. You know, we're telling our close friends and colleagues what we really think, but when we go out there, we daren't say what we really think because somebody will get offended, and then you risk your job, you risk your livelihood, you even risk being arrested. So I think this is a trend that we as Conservatives, as the party that should be upholding liberty and freedom, we should be the party that actually fights back against what I think is a trend that is undermining the very essence of what we are as a nation.
And did nothing about it for 14 years.
I beg your pardon?
And did nothing about it for 14 years. He's had ample opportunity to...
Well, I agree, yeah. Look, if you want to talk about the last 14 years, you'll have no argument from me. You know, we had 14 years, well, we had partly 14 years. Of course, some of that period was in coalition or minority government. But the last 5 years, when we had an 80-seat majority, my goodness, just think what you could do with an 80-seat majority in 5 years. Now, I'm told that the reason why we didn't do so many things is because of the pandemic. Well, my answer to that is the pandemic was actually an opportunity for us to do all kinds of things that in normal times would have been harder to do, getting rid of all kinds of layers of government that we didn't need. So we didn't use that 5 years and that 80-seat majority that Boris achieved to actually row back on state control, state interference, and the socialist attitudes that has crept in throughout every layer of government.
Excellent. Thank you. So if we can go to any more questions. There was a lady at the front, I think, had her hand up. Gentleman here then. Okay.
Thank you. I think I may have jumped the queue, but I just wanted to raise the issue of academic freedom. Our universities are no longer free. They're certainly not free in the way they were when I was studying science in the 1970s. Grants are not given if the subject matter is unpopular, particularly if it questions the climate change agenda in any way, whether it's technically or politically. We need to stop that. We need to get back to being able to do research in a free way. Academics are very concerned, and I know this myself. They are very restricted in what kind of research they can do, and the way students must be taught. So what are we going to do about that?
Thank you. I think there was a gentleman with glasses at the couple rows back. There you go.
Yes. The question that I've got is that having looked at the Tory party over the last 14 years, one of the biggest problems that I see is that we talk about a broad tent, but our tent is so damn broad that we let too many people in that are escapees from the Socialist Workers' Party, in my view. So what can we do to narrow the tent to get more Conservatives in the party, and especially in the parliamentary party?
Thank you. Joe, do you want to pick up the point on sort of the academic freedom side?
On academic freedom? Yeah, well, I'm not an academic myself, fairly obviously, but I do know a couple, and yeah, they echo your sentiment. Whenever there's discussion about topics which could be potentially incendiary, bits of research which could potentially yield slightly controversial outcomes and results, there's a kind of unwillingness to explore that. And as the gentleman said to you, Andrew, I mean, one could say that 14 years of right-wing governance did give ample opportunity for Conservative politicians to reform these kind of cultural institutions like universities and kind of ensure that they are keeping to their obligation to provide a kind of free discursive environment, but weren't. I know towards the end of that 14 years, there was the freedom of speech in higher education bill, which Labour have now scrapped, unsurprisingly. But yeah, it's clearly a huge problem, and just as we've been discussing with public health, it's that kind of risk aversion discursively is, I think, born of the same. It's the same risk aversion that drives bad policy. So I completely agree there's a problem there, but I'm not sure I have the solution.
Do you want to weigh in on that, Andrew?
So I think that one of the most detrimental things that I've witnessed in the last 20 odd years is certainly the expansion of universities and the education establishment, fine. But the problem is it's created an industry around academics, not just academics, but others who have used universities and education establishments to, I think, brainwash our next future generations into believing in things which I'm afraid are now showing in today's society and in a very detrimental way. So we've funded, effectively the state has funded this massive expansion of university education, and the result is that our youngsters are now in massive debts. They've gone to university, they've studied degrees which often don't lead to a proper career. So they've, in some senses, gone down the wrong path on that. But they've left being brainwashed with a lot of left-wing mumbo-jumbo in universities. And I think that's been a huge retrograde step. Now, the other point about how do we deal with the parliamentary party, well, I've got views on that one. And it all starts in central office, really. If you want to be a Conservative candidate and run as a Member of Parliament, I'm not interested personally in someone's gender or colour or where they're from or how they look. I want to know what they believe in. That's what I think is the most important thing. And so I think when we rebuild our candidates list for the next generation of MPs, the most important thing is that if you want to be a Conservative candidate, actually make sure, the party needs to make sure they actually believe in basic Conservative values. If we have a party that simply wants to have a parliamentary party which is just representing every type of minority group that there might, this is not how we do politics. I don't think that's how we should be doing politics. It's about getting people with passion and beliefs and character and principle. They're the kind of MPs we want, not people that are purely there because they've ticked a few boxes. So I think the way we choose our candidates as a party needs to radically change, and we need to go back to having Conservative MPs, Conservative candidates who actually espouse Conservative values.
Simon, would you care to weigh in on the sort of broad church Tory party and its socialist workers members?
Well, I'm not a member of the Tory party, so I don't want to put words into other people's mouths. But I think it's very true that we saw, particularly under David Cameron, that a lot of Tory candidates who became Tory MPs were not Conservatives at all. I won't name names, but basically they were Lib Dems. And in many cases, they've left the Tory party, and good riddance, frankly, because they didn't stand up for Tory principles. But then again, what are Tory principles? I think that's one of the problems that many of us have, looking outside, looking in. It's not really clear what Tory principles are these days. I mean, I grew up, I say I'm not a member of the party, I've always voted Conservative, and it's partly because I always associated two principles with the Conservative Party, and that was freedom of choice and personal responsibility. But clearly those principles have been chucked out the window over the last 14 years, and probably going back a bit before that as well. So I think one of the things that's got to happen sooner rather than later is for somebody to actually make very clear what are Conservative principles, and then you choose candidates who actually agree with those principles.
Excellent, thank you. Any more questions? So there's a gentleman with a yellow badge, is that? Yeah, and then a lady up the front here as well.
Simon Richards. It's such a pleasure in these days of obsession with optics that, as well as the eternally youthful Andrew and the rest of the panel, it's really nice to see somebody as ancient as I am in the form of Simon Clark on the panel.
Yeah, thanks to you too.
Ruthless.
Thank you, Simon. The question I'd like to ask is, Simon, I know, has fought valiantly for freedom for decades now. When we were both growing up, I sensed that people of our generation then, we were the future ones, as Dave Cameron might have said, that people really did care about freedom of speech and freedom of lifestyle issues as well. But I sense that's not the case with the very young generation now. I'm talking about the sort of late teens and early 20s somethings. Do you think that's the case? And if so, how do you think that can best be tackled?
Thank you. And then there's a lady at the front as well.
I believe that socialism has become ingrained in the UK, throughout the UK, partly because of devolution, because we now, when we have an election, we still have socialists in powers in parts of the UK, whereas before the socialists would be out, conservatives would be in. That's not the case these days, and so we are surrounded by this socialism. It's a political strategy because it looks compassionate, and if you are a conservative and believe in freedom, then you're painted as callous or uncaring, and that was able to increase during COVID. If you questioned vaccines, anything like that, you were cancelled, and I think it's part of the socialists' way of dominating this country, whether we have a conservative government or not. And it's devolution that is diluting conservatism in this country, so we never get full conservatism again. And you always then have evolved governments competing to show who can be the most compassionate. And also, as someone from Swansea who's lived under a socialist government for 27 years, you can't get rid of them because people become so reliant on them because it's their welfare, it's their housing, it's their jobs, and they're afraid to ever give that up and taste freedom again. And our young people, they just don't understand it. They just, I think, if you've experienced Labour, then someone like Margaret Thatcher, and now you've got this socialist. I mean, I know what Labour are going to do in the next 5 years, and we can't get rid of them.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Emily, the future generations.
Well, I speak, of course, as the least cool young person that I know. I was quite lucky myself in my university experience. I went to St Andrews, didn't really have any of those problems. I suspect I've been quite lucky too because my entire adult life has either been working in Parliament or for a free market think tank. I wouldn't say it's, so maybe this is sort of me being biased towards the people that I spend time with. I don't think that young people generally don't care about freedom. I work at the Adam Smith Institute, it's been said, we have something called the Next Generation Centre where we're trying to do policies for young people, by young people. We have lots of people coming to our events. We have someone that works part-time at the FSU. So we're doing quite a lot of work about that. I think you've made the point that people don't care about, your young people don't really care about liberty, and they don't care that people are banning stuff. But I would make the point that people aren't as pro banning stuff as you think, insofar as they don't think it's a political priority, right? So if you look at the smoking bill, Survation did a poll that said even half of 102 Labour MPs said the tobacco and vapes bill was a really low priority. People tend to care more about public services, cost of living, housing, etc. So I think that maybe we could just make the point that we're just spending too much time on banning things when we should be spending more time making life better for young people.
Excellent. Andrew, on the point of socialism in devolved governments. And,
Well, the lady from Swansea made a superb point about devolution, but I'd go further than that. We as a party have swallowed up this idea that creating more layers of government is a good thing. I think it's a very bad thing. I don't want to see all these different layers of government. I've seen Conservative Party promoting these all-important mayors, things like the Greater London Assembly we have in Greater London, police and crime commissioners, more layers of government, more politicians, more bureaucracy, more political interference, when most of it isn't really necessary. a lot of it actually is shoveling money into new bureaucratic structures that actually don't deliver for the people. So I want to get back to the Conservative Party having the principles of small government and less layers of government. And if you're talking about devolution, thank you, talking about devolution, the real devolution is giving power back to people directly. So the power should rest with the individual before it rests with councillors and quangos and regional bodies and mayors and all these other people that we seem to have loved creating. I don't agree with any of it. I think that Mrs. Thatcher was completely right when she got rid of the Greater London Council in the 1980s. We got rid of it. I mean, I'm an Essex MP, but unfortunately we're told we're a London borough. Most people in Romford, of course, believe they're Essex. But we're stuck in Greater London, so we're shoveling money in to the centre, getting very little for it. But we're told that having all these layers of government is good for us. I don't believe it is. I'd like to go back to having a lower level of government, the most local level possible, smaller councils that genuinely look after your community and your town, and we don't need these extra bits in the middle. And I think that you could reduce the size of government by getting rid of a lot of that, and you could save a lot of money and allow people to keep more of the tax that they earn, and we can reduce the overall size of the state. So I think that in 2029, if we have a new Conservative government, we need a radical plan to get rid of a lot of this stuff and go back to having small government and devolve power back to the people. That's the kind of agenda I'd like to see we adopt.
I think we have time for one more round of questions. So there's a gentleman on the end of the third row there, and a chap in the middle just here.
Yeah, hi. I just want to raise a point of the fashionability of ideas, because actually there's many ways over the last 40 to 50 years in which actually you could argue that government has come to trust people more. So take, for example, it's much easier to get a divorce than it used to be. We allow changing of gender much more easily, including for often quite young children. Gay marriage has now been legalised. They're even talking about legalising assisted dying. And it's obviously quite fashionable amongst some left-wing parties to actually legalise drugs. So it strikes me that to some extent it's about what is fashionable within the current intellectual milieu, about what freedoms people should have and what freedoms people shouldn't have. And I find it quite striking that you have a government that is going to ban people from smoking, but allow people to literally take their own life. And so I think it's worth discussing to what extent ideas are fashionable.
Thank you. And there's a chap in the middle.
Yeah. Actually, touching on a fairly similar point. One of the statements before was that there's a 70% opposition support for the ban on single-use vapes. But if we look at freedom, if you see most of the conversation, we always reverb within the Tory party to talk about the freedoms which we enjoy. Whether it's smoking, whether it's drinking, whether it's elements of free speech that we like to talk about. But if we really want to drive clear blue water, we need to go back to freedom of choice. And one of the fundamental elements is, if you look at cannabis and other soft drugs, there's a majority of the population in favour of legalisation or decriminalisation. Actually, among younger voters, you have only 28% in opposition. And most voters have no idea of the average sentencing length that you get for simple possession of these drugs today. So what I would ask is, if we're looking at actually creating blue water and potentially nurturing reform with something they cannot replicate, is there not a real open ground in looking at drug liberalisation and expansion of freedoms in all aspects, including the areas which we do not personally like?
Joe, would you care to chime in on the sort of fashionable ideas and what have you?
Yeah. No, you're completely right. Sort of as time has moved on, attitudes socially have changed, but one idea which has basically remained fashionable for God knows how many decades is basically left-wing statism. And the point that was made earlier, that it's somehow the fault of young people who don't appreciate freedom, who think that it's the state's role to step in and solve all of their problems. You're right to an extent. There are indeed lots of annoying young people with colourful hair who don't want you to think or say anything remotely controversial. But it should also be remembered that it wasn't my generation who voted in Attlee. It wasn't my generation who voted in Wilson. It's my grandparents and your grandparents who voted in the people who created the institutions of state that now drive leftism and that have kind of inundated young people with this idea that in order for a government to run effectively, it has to be in some way socialist. So, yes, social attitudes have changed, but tragically, economically, the socialist instinct has pervaded for at least the last century, which is something that, of course, needs to change. But yeah, it's not just the fault of young people. It's important to remember that.
Excellent. Andrew, how about on a similar theme, the sort of fashionable ideas of what should be liberalising and what not?
So, I think that, as I've said at the start of my remarks today, we should base everything we do as a party on the fundamental principle of freedom with responsibility under a rule of law. That doesn't mean we believe in total freedom and no laws to control anything at all. That's not what conservatism is. It's a balance between freedom of choice, freedom to live your life as you choose, but also responsibility to those around you and the wider society. So there are issues where we probably would have some disagreement about where that line is drawn. Clearly, the current government and the previous Conservative government were taking things way too far. However, we can't completely abolish the ability of government to make valued judgments about what has to happen within society. We do live in a democracy, so there has to be some form of give and take. And clearly the issue that could divide many people, probably in this room, throughout the party, is the idea of the legalisation of certain types of drugs, and cannabis in particular. There is a debate to be had on that. There are those who think we should liberalise and we could create clear blue water, as the gentleman said down there. There are others who think that to start to liberalise drugs is actually going to lead to worse consequences in society. That's a legitimate debate within a Conservative Party to have. There's not a right or wrong particularly, but we all have our own personal views on that. So there has to be a debate on some of these things, but the core values have to be based on freedom with responsibility. If we just base everything on that, a lot of the nonsense that we've been sucked into in the last 14 years would not have happened. So that's the perspective that I come from. I hope that makes it clear. But I'm sure there's debates on a lot of issues here. I mean, foods, for instance. I mean, you know, this sort of agenda to wean people off certain types of foods. Look, you know, we all want to eat healthily, don't we? You know, there's no doubt about that. But it's our choice. You know, if I choose to eat certain types of foods that I like, its consequences are on me if I eat the wrong stuff. But you've got to give people the right to make their own decisions. It's not up to politicians and civil servants and local councils to impose a lifestyle on the individual. And we as Conservatives need to fight back against that agenda.
Thank you. Very, very quickly, as we are swiftly running out of time, Emily and Simon, do you care to weigh in on the freedom of choice and legalisation of cannabis and what have you? I'm not sure where Boris stands on this one.
Well, it's interesting because it often comes up actually in interviews where I'm asked, well, look, you know, you defend smoking tobacco, but what about a lot of other drugs, cannabis, heroin, and all the rest of it? And it is a debate that needs to be had. I mean, going back to the gentleman over there who was talking about, you know, what's fashionable. I mean, it's certainly true that smoking cannabis is fashionable these days, whereas smoking tobacco isn't. And going back to something that Simon was saying earlier on about reaching out to younger generations, I mean, we try and reach out to younger generations by inviting younger people to our events. So we've got an event coming up in 3 weeks' time in Westminster, a boat party, Smoke on the Water, to which you are all invited. And we're inviting representatives of Students for Liberty, the Hayek Society at the LSE. We're inviting Labour students, so we're always looking to reach out to younger generations. And we know that smoking, for many of them, is not a major issue. So we say to them, something I've always said, because I'm not a smoker, and I've always believed that what Forest does is not about smoking, it's about a much bigger picture, and it's about how far should government dictate the way we live our lives. That's the debate that we're trying to have. And as Andrew was saying, I mean, I think it's all about education and not compulsion. And that debate needs to be had within the Conservative Party, and as I was saying a bit earlier, I think actually there's a wonderful opportunity for the Conservative Party, not just during this leadership contest, but over the next few years, to actually be the party that stands up and says, we stand for freedom of choice and personal responsibility. And by doing that, you will stand out, certainly from the Labour Party, certainly from the Lib Dems. That's the direction I think you need to go, because a phrase that's been used a lot today is getting clear blue water between the parties, and that's one way you'll be able to do it.
Excellent. And very, very quickly, Emily, I'm afraid we are out of time. But,
I completely agree with what the second gentleman said about freedom of choice. It kind of comes back to what we were talking about earlier, the difference between nudging and forcing. So, for example, there's obviously a difference between making alcohol-free cider available in pubs and banning alcohol. There's obviously a difference between legalising something like Swedish snus so people have more options to quit if they wish, versus banning cigarettes. There's obviously a difference between making what people deem to be junk food more expensive, or maybe implementing policies which makes healthy food from abroad cheaper by removing tariffs, for example. So I think that's something that we should really be looking at more as a party.
Excellent. Well, thank you all very much for coming this morning, and please give your thanks in the usual way to our panel. Cheers, guys.
Okay.
Thank you very much.